Listen closely, because what we are about to peel back isn't just a story about a single fraud case or a heated exchange in a marble room in DC. It is about a much larger, much more sinister machinery that operates right under our noses while we are distracted by the 24-hour news cycle. We are told to look at the faces on the screen, to pick a side in the partisan bickering, but the real story is always written in the ledgers that no one is supposed to see. When Tulsi Gabbard stood across from Ilhan Omar, it wasn't just two politicians clashing. It was a momentary glitch in the matrix where the veil was pulled back just enough for us to see the rot beneath. You have to ask yourself why $1 billion intended for the most vulnerable among us, hungry children during a global crisis, simply vanished into a void of shell companies and political kickbacks. It is almost too perfect, isn't it? A crisis hits, the printing presses at the Treasury start screaming, and suddenly billions of dollars are flowing with almost zero oversight into the hands of organizations that seem to have appeared out of thin air. We are told it was a mistake, a byproduct of bureaucratic haste, but in this town, money of that magnitude doesn't just get lost by accident. Every dollar has a destination and every recipient has a connection. When you look at the Minnesota fraud case, you aren't just looking at a few bad actors skimming off the top. You are looking at a blueprint for how the elite feed off the taxpayer while wrapping themselves in the flag of social justice and community outreach. Tulsi Gabbard, a woman who has already burned her bridges with the establishment, seemed to be the only one willing to follow the breadcrumbs where they actually led. While the rest of the committee was playing nice or following the pre-approved talking points, she went for the jugular. Why? Because when you see a member of Congress whose inner circle, whose donors, and whose legislative allies are all tied to the same pot of missing gold, you aren't looking at a coincidence. You are looking at a syndicate. Omar's defense was the standard play from the modern political handbook. Call it a smear, call it bias, call it anything but what it actually is, a documented trail of diverted funds. Think about the timing of all this. The world was locked down, people were terrified, and the government told us that the only way to survive was to trust them with unprecedented amounts of capital. That is the perfect environment for a heist. If you wanted to funnel $1 billion into a political machine, could you imagine a better cover than feeding hungry children? It's the ultimate shield. If you question the spending, you're the villain. If you demand an audit, you're heartless. But as the layers started to peel away in that hearing, we saw that the children were just the props. The real stars of the show were the consultants, the non-profits with no track record, and the political operatives who suddenly found their pockets very, very deep. We have to look at the architecture of the fraud itself. It wasn't just one guy with a fake invoice. It was a network. $1 billion is a massive amount of physical space if you had it in cash, yet it moved through the Minnesota system like water through a sieve. Did the oversight committees just go blind for a year? Or were they told to look the other way? When Gabbard presented evidence linking Omar's staff and campaign donors to this misappropriation, she wasn't just attacking a colleague. She was pointing out that the call was coming from inside the house. The documents she held weren't just papers. They were a map of how the swamp actually functions when the lights are off. Omar's reaction tells you everything you need to know about how power protects itself in Washington. She didn't offer a line-by-line rebuttal. She didn't open her books to prove her innocence. She went for the deflection. She tried to frame the entire investigation as a targeted hit, an act of Islamophobia or partisan spite. It's a tired script, but it's effective because it stops the conversation. But the numbers don't have a religion and the bank transfers don't have a political party. $1 billion is gone. It didn't go to the kitchens. It didn't go to the families in Minneapolis. So, where did it go? If you follow the money, you usually find the truth, and the truth in this case leads directly into the heart of a very specific political ecosystem. The collapse of Omar's support following that hearing wasn't just a political shift. It was a controlled demolition. When the evidence becomes too loud to ignore, even your allies start to back away, not out of morality, but out of self-preservation. They saw the receipts. They saw the names on the donor lists matching the names on the federal indictments. You have to wonder, how many other relief funds across this country were used as private ATMs for the political class? Minnesota was just the one that got caught because someone like Gabbard decided to go off script. How many billions more are sitting in the offshore accounts of community organizers in other states? This isn't just about one congresswoman from Minnesota. This is about the illusion of accountability. We watch these hearings and we think, finally, someone is getting caught. But look at the aftermath. Has the money been recovered? Have the architects of the system, the ones who signed the checks and bypassed the audits, been put in orange jumpsuits? Or have we just moved on to the next scandal? The skeptic knows that these public displays of justice often just ways to vent public anger so that the underlying system can continue to operate. They give us a villain so we don't look at the structure that created the villain. The evidence Gabbard brought forward was devastating because it was forensic. It wasn't just hearsay. We are talking about legislation that was supposedly written to help people, but was actually engineered with enough loopholes to drive a freight train of cash through. Who wrote those loopholes? Which staffers were in the room? When you see a representative staff directly tied to the entities receiving the funds, the line between public service and organized crime becomes dangerously thin. It makes you realize that the government isn't a protector. It's a marketplace where our tax dollars are the product being sold to the highest bidder. As the federal investigations began to swirl, the narrative in the media shifted. Suddenly, it was a complicated matter of administrative oversight. They love that word, oversight. It implies that someone just forgot to check a box. But you don't forget $1 billion. You distribute it. You allocate it. You reward your friends with it. The public condemnation from Omar's own constituents was perhaps the most telling part of the whole saga. These are the people she claimed to represent, the people who were supposed to benefit from that food program. When they turned on her, it wasn't because of propaganda. It was because they looked at their empty plates and then looked at the luxury cars and the campaign fat cats, and they finally did the math. But let's go deeper. Is it possible that this hearing was allowed to happen because Omar had become a liability to the larger democratic machine? In the world of high-stakes politics, everyone is expendable. If you get too greedy, or if your scandals start to threaten the collective, the herd will cull you. Was Tulsi Gabbard the weapon, or was she just the one brave enough to pull the trigger? The way the establishment media handled the fallout suggests a calculated distancing. They let her hang out to dry. They didn't come to her rescue with the usual fervor. That suggests that the powers that be had already decided her time was up, and the Minnesota fraud case was the perfect exit ramp. When the microphones were cut and the cameras stopped rolling, the real silence wasn't in the room. It was in the halls of power where the implications of those documents began to sink in. We have to examine the feeding our future scandal not as an isolated incident of greed, but as a diagnostic test for the state of American governance. Think about the mechanics of the heist. The federal government funnels money to the state funnels it to non-profits, and the non-profits funnel it to contractors. It is a hall of mirrors designed specifically to ensure that when the money disappears, there is no single throat to choke. But Tulsi Gabbard did something the establishment hates. She started naming names. She started drawing lines between the campaign contributions hitting Omar's accounts and the very individuals who were allegedly fabricating thousands of names of hungry children to trigger government checks. Does it strike you as a coincidence that the most vocal progressive voices, those who scream the loudest about the working class, always seem to be at the center of these massive financial webs? You have to ask, is the activism the goal, or is the activism the camouflage? If you are a politician and you want to move $1 billion of untraceable cash, you don't send it to a bank in the Cayman Islands. That's too obvious. You send it to a community food program in a high-poverty district. You wrap it in the language of empathy. You make it so that any investigator who dares to look into the books is immediately branded as a bigot or a hater. It's a brilliant, if demonic, strategy. It uses the public's own morality as a shield for corruption. But Gabbard wasn't playing by those rules. She looked past the optics and focused on the shell companies. One of the most haunting aspects of this deep dive is the realization of how easy it was. We are talking about people buying real estate in coastal resorts, luxury vehicles, and jewelry. all with money that was meant for milk and bread for impoverished kids in Minneapolis. How does a freshman staffer for a congresswoman oversee the flow of tens of millions of dollars without anyone in the Department of Education or the state government raising a red flag? The only logical conclusion is that the red flags were suppressed. In the world of the skeptic, incompetence is the excuse they give you when the truth is collusion. You don't lose $1 billion because you're bad at math. You lose it because you've been paid to stop counting. Let's talk about the specific links to Omar's inner circle. When the FBI began raiding those offices, they weren't just looking at random fraudsters. They were looking at people who sat in the front rows of her town halls. People who organized her get out the vote efforts. This is how the deep state functions at a local level. It's a system of patronage. I give you the legislative cover to access federal grants, and you give me the ground game and the campaign cash to stay in power. It's a closed loop. The children don't get fed, but the machine stays fueled. And when Omar stood there, trying to dismiss Gabbard's interrogation as a right-wing conspiracy theory, she forgot one thing. The grand jury indictments were already being printed. You can argue with a politician, but it's much harder to argue with a federal search warrant. The isolation of Ilhan Omar in the months following that hearing was a masterclass in political abandonment. You see, in the shadow world, you are only useful as long as you are clean enough to maintain plausible deniability. The moment Gabbard dragged those bank records into the light, Omar became radioactive. Suddenly, the colleagues who used to post selfies with her were nowhere to be found. The donors who fueled her rise started looking for the next vanguard of the movement. But don't be fooled. They weren't abandoning her because they were shocked by the fraud. They were abandoning her because she got caught. The fraud is the feature, not the bug. The panic in the DC elite wasn't about the stolen billion. It was the fear that the investigation might spread to other states, other programs, and other representatives. Consider the global refugee angle that is often played up in these narratives. We are told that these programs are about integrating vulnerable populations. But what if they are actually being used as a human shield for financial racketeering? By centering the fraud within a specific immigrant community, the architects of this scheme ensured that any criticism could be framed as a xenophobic attack. It's a sophisticated form of psychological warfare against the taxpayer. They take your money, and then they tell you that if you want to know where it went, you're a bad person. It's a gaslighting technique on a national scale. But when you have $1 billion hole in the budget, gaslighting only works for so long before the cold, hard reality of the numbers sets in. And what of the mainstream media? Notice how they pivoted. When the scandal first broke, the headlines were buried. When the hearing happened, they focused on the tone of the exchange rather than the substance of the allegations. They talked about Gabbard's aggression instead of the missing billion. This is how the narrative is managed. They don't want you thinking about the money. They want you thinking about the vibe of the argument. They want you to think it's just two women who don't like each other, rather than a whistleblower exposing a systemic theft of public resources. If the media were actually doing their job, every single person who signed off on those Minnesota grants would be under a 24/7 spotlight. Instead, they are allowed to quietly resign and disappear into the private sector. We have to ask the follow the money question. Where is the $1 billion now? Some of it was spent on cars and houses, sure, but that's small change. Where is the rest? Does it sit in offshore accounts waiting to be funneled back into the 2026 or 2028 election cycles? Does it fund the dark money groups that orchestrate the protests we see on the news? In the world of political finance, money never truly disappears. It just changes form. It moves from a social program to a political action committee through a series of untraceable handshakes. The Minnesota case is the Rosetta Stone for understanding how the modern American political machine launders tax dollars to maintain its own grip on power. Tulsi Gabbard's role in this is equally fascinating from a skeptic's point of view. Why her? Why then? She had already been sidelined by the DNC. She was a pariah in her own party. Perhaps she knew she had nothing left to lose, which made her the most dangerous person in the room. Or perhaps she was the designated hitter, the one person who could deliver the blow because the establishment needed a way to purge a problematic member without getting their own hands dirty. In this game, there are no heroes, only players with different objectives. Gabbard's interrogation was surgical. She didn't miss. She had the data, she had the timeline, and she had the nerve to look Omar in the eye and ask the questions that the FBI was already asking behind closed doors. The squad and their allies like to talk about dismantling systems of oppression. But as we look at the wreckage of the Minnesota fraud case, it appears they aren't dismantling the system, they are mastering it. They've found the cheat codes. They've realized that if you shout equity loud enough, no one will hear the sound of the vault door opening. The real oppression isn't what they talk about on TV. It's the systematic theft of the future from the very people they claim to protect. Those hungry children in Minnesota were just entries on a spreadsheet, used to unlock a treasury that was never meant for them. As we move forward, we must stay vigilant. The Minnesota scandal is not the end. It is a preview. As more federal relief money is pumped into the economy under various guises, climate change, infrastructure, public health, the opportunities for this type of industrial-scale graft only grow. The playbook has been written. The actors are in place. And the oversight is, as we've seen, often just a part of the act. We must continue to ask the questions that make them uncomfortable. We must continue to look at the donor lists. And we must never forget that in Washington, the truth is often just the story they haven't figured out how to hide yet. The silence following the collapse of the Minnesota Feeding Our Future scheme is perhaps the loudest part of this whole conspiracy. If you think the story ends with a few indictments and a congresswoman losing her shine, you aren't paying attention to the shadows. We have to look at the deep dive into the infrastructure of the NGOs involved. These weren't just grassroots organizations. They were sophisticated financial nodes. When Tulsi Gabbard pressed Ilhan Omar on the specific legislative language that allowed these funds to bypass traditional audits, she was touching the third pill of the administrative state. You see, the law was written with intentional ambiguity. It was designed to prioritize speed over accuracy, a classic Trojan horse for those looking to siphon off massive amounts of capital without the pesky interference of a paper trail. We have to ask, who actually authored the provisions that removed the boots on the ground verification requirements for these food sites? In the world of the skeptic, there are no coincidences, only coordinated lapses in judgment. Was it a coincidence that these specific waivers were championed by the very same political circles that received the largest influx of grassroots donations shortly thereafter? If you look at the flow of funds, it mirrors a classic laundering cycle. Federal money goes in as aid. It gets sliced into thousands of smaller payments to contractors who don't exist, and it comes back out as campaign contributions from concerned citizens. This isn't just a Minnesota problem. This is a federal blueprint for how to turn a crisis into a permanent political war chest. Let's look at the sovereignty of the investigation itself. Why did the state-level authorities in Minnesota wait so long to act? We are told they were investigating, but the records show that whistleblowers were screaming into the void for months while the checks continued to clear. In any other industry, if $1 billion goes missing, the CEO is in handcuffs within a week. But in the world of the political elite, you get a grace period to clean up the evidence. It was only when the FBI, an agency with its own complicated relationship with the truth, stepped in that the narrative became impossible to contain. And even then, look at who was targeted. The small fish, the runners, the guys who bought the Lamborghinis. The people who signed the checks and the politicians who provided the legislative cover remain largely untouched, insulated by a layer of plausible deniability. Think about the psychological toll this takes on the public. By the time the truth comes out, the public is already exhausted by the next manufactured crisis. This is the blur, the strategic use of information overload to hide a specific, massive theft. While the headlines were screaming about international conflicts or the latest social media outrage, $1 billion was being drained from the future of American children. When Gabbard stood in that hearing, she was trying to break through the blur. She was trying to force a moment of clarity. But the machine is designed to heal itself. The media quickly rebranded the scandal as a logistical failure, a boring, technical term that makes people want to change the channel. They don't want you to see the predatory nature of the system. They want you to think it's just a broken engine that needs more taxpayer oil. There is also the question of the informer. In a scandal this large, someone always talks. The question for us is, who are they talking to? Are the federal investigators actually looking for the truth, or are they looking for leverage? In Washington, $1 billion scandal is better than gold. It's a way to keep people in line. If you have the receipts on a sitting member of Congress, you own them. You have to wonder if the sudden cooperation we saw from certain political factions after the hearing was a sign of a plea deal happening behind the curtain. Is Ilhan Omar still in office because she's innocent, or because she's now more useful as a compromised asset than as a martyr? The skeptic must also look at the digital paper trail or the lack thereof. In an era where every transaction is tracked, how does $1 billion move through a state system without triggering a single automated red flag at the Treasury? Unless, of course, the system was told that these specific accounts were vetted and protected. This implies a level of high-level access that goes far beyond a few corrupt non-profit directors. We are talking about the gatekeepers of the financial system itself. When you follow the money, you eventually hit a wall of national security or privacy protections. That wall exists for a reason, to protect the people who built the wall. As the smoke clears from the Gabbard-Omar confrontation, we are left with a chilling reality. The feeding our future scandal wasn't an anomaly. It was a demonstration of power. It showed that the elite can steal $1 billion in broad daylight, using the most vulnerable people as human shields, and largely get away with it. They give us a few villains to satisfy our thirst for justice, but the machine keeps turning. The people of Minnesota, the taxpayers of America, and the hungry children who are used as props are all just collateral damage in a much larger game of global financial chess. What happens next? The pattern suggests that this money, now laundered and dispersed, will reappear in the next election cycle. It will fund the digital ads, the influencers, and the community outreach programs that keep the same actors in power. The only way to stop it is to refuse the official story. To look at the hearing not as a resolution, but as a starting point for a deeper investigation. We have to be the ones who don't move on. We have to be the ones who keep asking, where is the rest of the money? And who signed the waivers? Because if we don't, they'll just do it again. And next time, it won't be $1 billion. It'll be 10. The deeper we dig, the more we realize that the Minnesota case was never just about food. It was about a new kind of invisible currency. We are entering an era where political power is no longer bought with simple bribes, but through the creation of parallel economies. When you look at the structure of the organizations Tulsi Gabbard spotlighted, they weren't just distribution centers, they were recruitment hubs. They were building a shadow electorate funded by the very taxpayers they were undermining. If you control the food, you control the people. If you control the money meant for the food, you control the politicians who claim to represent those people. It's a closed-loop system of dependency that ensures no one ever dares to speak out, lest the charity disappear. One of the most disturbing questions left hanging in that hearing room was the matter of the disappearing databases. During the peak of the investigation, multiple reports surfaced of digital records being wiped, laptops being lost, and servers mysteriously crashing. In the age of the cloud, nothing is truly lost unless someone wants it to be. This suggests a level of technical sophistication and coordination that points towards state-level actors or high-level intelligence operatives. Was this a domestic operation, or were there international interests involved? Remember, Ilhan Omar has always occupied a strange space in American foreign policy discussions. Is it possible that the feeding our future money wasn't just staying in Minnesota? Is it possible it was being used to fund interests far beyond our borders, effectively turning American tax dollars into a weapon against American interests? Let's talk about the media blackout on the legislative architects. While the foot soldiers of this fraud are being sentenced to years in prison, the people who actually drafted the emergency rules that made the fraud possible are receiving promotions. They are being moved into higher positions within the federal government or the DNC infrastructure. In any other world, This would be a scandal of Nixonian proportions. But because it happened under the guise of pandemic relief, it is treated as a heroic effort that simply had a few unfortunate leaks. The skeptic knows that a leak is a mistake. A billion-dollar flood is an intentional act of engineering. They opened the floodgates and then acted surprised when the water rushed in. We must also analyze the timing of Tulsi Gabbard's exit from the party shortly after these types of confrontations. She was branded a Russian asset by Hillary Clinton and a traitor by the mainstream press. But if you look at the timeline, her most aggressive attacks on the party's financial ethics coincided perfectly with her being pushed to the margins. They couldn't disprove her data, so they had to destroy her character. It's the standard operating procedure for the deep state. If the message is dangerous, kill the messenger. By the time she stood before Omar with those folders of evidence, she was already a ghost in the machine, a woman with nothing to lose, which is why she was able to speak the truths that her colleagues only whispered in the cloakrooms. And what about the recovery of the funds? The Department of Justice makes a big show of seizing a few houses and a couple of luxury watches, but that accounts for maybe 5% of the total theft. Where is the other $950 million? That kind of money doesn't just sit in a bank account waiting for the FBI to find it. It moves through crypto mixers, through real estate holding companies in Dubai, through consulting fees paid to family members of the elite. The truth is, they don't want to find the money because the money is already back in the system, working for the very people who are supposed to be watching it. The investigation is the theater. The theft is the reality. Look at the way the public has been conditioned to respond. If you bring up the billion-dollar fraud today, you are told it's old news. This is the amnesia effect. The system relies on our inability to stay focused on one crime for more than a few weeks. They know that as long as they keep the outrage machine fed with new, smaller scandals, we will never demand a full accounting of the big ones. But we have to remember. We have to remember the names on those indictments and the names on those legislative bills. We have to remember that while our neighbors were losing their businesses and our children were being locked out of schools, a select group of connected individuals was treating the US Treasury like a personal piggy bank. As we wrap up this deep dive, we have to look at the long game. The Minnesota fraud wasn't just a one-time heist. It was a test of the fences. The elite wanted to see how much they could take before the public noticed. They wanted to see how effectively they could use identity politics to shield financial crimes. And based on the results, they passed with flying colors. The system is now more entrenched, their emergency powers are now codified, and the next billion-dollar relief package is already being drafted in some windowless room on Capitol Hill. The only thing standing in their way is a public that refuses to stop asking questions. Tulsi Gabbard and Ilhan Omar were the faces of this particular chapter, but they are just symbols of a much larger struggle between the truth and the official narrative. One represents the dangerous act of looking at the receipts. The other represents the power of the protected class. Which side are you on? Are you willing to see the world as it is, or are you satisfied with the version they show you on the 6 o'clock news? The evidence is there. The money is gone. The question is, what are we going to do about it before the next crisis arrives? As we move into 2026, the dust hasn't settled. It has crystallized into a terrifying new reality. If you think the Feeding Our Future saga was just a pandemic-era glitch, look at the convictions stacking up. As of late 2025, over 50 individuals have pleaded guilty. We aren't talking about clerical errors. We are talking about a coordinated strike on the US Treasury that has seen ringleaders like Amy Bock and Salim Said convicted on all counts of wire fraud and bribery. But even with these victories for the DOJ, the skeptic has to look at the ledger. Out of the $250 million admitted to be stolen, only a fraction, around $75 million, has actually been recovered. Where is the other $175 million? In a world of digital footprints, money of that magnitude doesn't just vanish unless the exits were greased. The confrontation between Tulsi Gabbard and Ilhan Omar was the catalyst that forced this rot into the light. Now that Gabbard has ascended to the role of Director of National Intelligence in the current administration, the stakes have shifted from political theater to national security. The hearings in early 2025 weren't just about Minnesota. They were about a worldwide threats assessment. When Gabbard looks at Omar now, she isn't just looking at a colleague. She's looking through the lens of the highest intelligence office in the land. The question being whispered in the corridors of the Hoover building is simple. Was this fraud a localized crime, or was it a funding mechanism for something much larger? The fact that suspects were being arrested at airports as late as mid-2025, trying to flee the country with suitcases of secrets, tells you that the network is still very much active. Omar's defense has shifted from smear campaign to administrative oversight, but the public isn't buying it anymore. Even her own base in Minnesota is beginning to fracture as the federal sentences get longer. 12 years for some, 10 years for others. When the people you campaigned with are heading to federal prison for bribing jurors with $120,000 in cash, as we saw in the Abdimajid Nur case, the plausible deniability starts to look like a cheap costume. The skeptic asks, if they were willing to bribe a juror to protect the secret, what were they willing to do to get the money in the first place? And more importantly, who was the ultimate beneficiary of a scheme that claimed to serve 18 million fake meals? We are watching the slow-motion collapse of a protected class. The Minnesota model of fraud is being cited now as the primary reason for the massive overhaul of temporary protected status and refugee programs. It's the ultimate irony. The very people Omar claimed to protect are the ones being punished because her inner circle allegedly treated their needs as a line item for embezzlement. But don't expect a clean ending. In the world of the deep dive, the conviction of a few masterminds is often just a way to close the book so no one looks at the sequel. As long as the majority of the money remains unrecoverable in overseas accounts, the machine remains funded for the next cycle. The hearing was the opening act. The real play is happening in the bank accounts we aren't allowed to see.